From previous research, we know that the proximity to failure of a set seems to influence the stimulus for muscle growth. However, this concept is usually discussed in the context of full range of motion training. With the findings of a recent preprint by Larson and colleagues, it may be time to revise the way we would define proximity to failure and potentially take into account the range of motion in which momentary failure occurs. The study by Larson and colleagues employed a unique within-participant unilateral study design. 23 untrained participants had their lower limbs randomized into one of two conditions. The first condition we'll call full range of motion failure, where each set was performed until a participant could not complete a full calf raise, or what they called maximal plantar flexion. This would be when your foot is entirely extended at the very top of a calf raise. The second condition, what we'll call partial range of motion failure, is where each set was performed until a participant could not complete even a partial calf raise, or what they called maximum dorsiflexion. Similarly, this is where your foot is all the way in the stretched position at the bottom of a calf raise. The participants trained the Smith machine standing calf raise twice a week for 10 weeks with 3 to 4 sets per session per limb. Measurements were taken both before and after the intervention at multiple time points, and then ultimately used those observations for analysis. To summarize the results, the authors found that the growth of the medial gastrocnemius meaningfully favored the partial range of motion failure condition. Importantly, this estimate had around a 99% probability of exceeding 0, which would be no difference between conditions, and I personally calculated around an 88.6% probability of exceeding the author's typical error of measurement that was achieved at baseline. I'd even expect these probabilities to be higher if all the ultrasound scans that the authors took were included in their statistical models, rather than just averaging the scans, which is what it seems that they did in their methods. Thus, I think there's very likely something going on here that is definitely worth considering. From a practical perspective, it's tough to know which of the following uncontrolled factors are actually leading to the difference between conditions. We have greater total training volume due to the additional repetitions, we have greater exposure to the length and position of the muscle, and we have a potentially greater relative stimulus of a close proximity to true failure in the partial range of motion condition. And of course, all of these are reasonable explanations and probably contribute to some degree, but how this study inspires a potential reframing of the concept of proximity to failure is what I find personally the most interesting. Typically, we define proximity to failure as the number of repetitions in reserve relative to the point in a task we cannot complete it despite maximal effort to do so. This is often called momentary failure. However, this study questions what the appropriate definition of the task really is. If we are unable to perform additional full range of motion reps, but we have plenty of partial reps in the tank, and those particularly in the length and position of a muscle, it may be worth continuing a set to get closer to a quote-unquote true failure point in which the implement can't really be moved at all. In this way, proximity to failure may be best viewed as the percentage of force capacity that is remaining in the limiting joint angle of a muscle. From an ecological validity perspective, I find this to be a compelling approach to increase the stimulus per set with the minimal additional time investment. Of course, it's worth considering the potential downstream implications of this type of an approach if you were to use it with a good amount of your training. In theory, these additional repetitions do come with additional stimulus, but there also may be fatigue that may potentially impair your ability to tolerate a given amount of training volume or psychologically gauge your proximity to failure. That said, I always like to view these types of concerns as if-then statements. If you find your ability to tolerate a given amount of training volume is meaningfully impaired, then it may be worth considering making an adjustment. Similarly, if you find your psychological ability to train progressively for the rest of your session is negatively impacted, then you may want to reserve this type of approach for later in the session or only on some exercises. Ultimately, more work is needed to tease out exactly what's going on here. Is it the additional volume? Is it the exposure to the length and position? Is it the fact that we are getting a greater relative stimulus from being closer to quote-unquote true failure in some of these exercises? And does this actually replicate in other muscles? There's a lot of things that we need to do to really understand if performing some additional partial repetitions at the end of a set really is going to be a big bang for our buck in kind of all context. But as a first step, I think this is really intriguing and may further expand how we kind of think about proximity to failure and inform the training process. In the meantime, I think we can tentatively create 3 major scenarios when performing your sets to partial range of motion failure may make sense. The first is going to be if the exercise is very challenging in the shortened position. Think back training, calves are a good example, like in this study, or any other training where the exercise is really, really challenging when the muscle is contracted. Typically, these are going to be the exercises where you have a lot of partials in reserve and a meaningful amount of repetitions can be continuously accumulated if you extend the set. The next case would be just if you're short on time. I think this is a really, really easy way to maximize and cram in a ton of stimulus when you don't have a ton of time to train. So this is a really, really cost-effective option in terms of your time that you have available, and you don't have to use multiple pieces of equipment, etc. So it's really helpful in those scenarios. And then 3, if you're just looking for an easy way to increase your total training dose for stubborn areas that you are looking to try to really maximize. So if you're already performing high volume training, and you're doing a lot of things to try to check your boxes to really bring up an area, I think this is another place that you can look to try to add additional stimulus to try to really get that stubborn area to budge if you're trying to break a plateau. Current research defines proximity to failure as the distance from an inability to complete a given task. However, this study offers a compelling example of how this definition of proximity to failure could be leaving some important details off the table, which may meaningfully influence training prescription. Once again, I'd love to see this study replicated in other muscles and with some other potential conditions to isolate that really causal variable of the additional stimulus, but provide some really solid rationale for practice in the interim. If you liked the video, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, and let us know what you want to see from us next in the comments below. If you want more free content like this directly in your inbox, sign up to our newsletter, which is the first link below.